At 42 years of age, Clara Mercer stood on the frost-bitten mud of the Oakhaven timber yard, entirely destitute after the town's wealthiest land baron, Thaddeus Vance, foreclosed on her late father's mill and cast her out into the bitter winter of 1884. With nothing left in her patched woolen pockets but a pair of silver $half and a dented copper penny, she made a desperate, seemingly foolish decision at the town's junk auction, placing her last 2 silver coins as the solitary bid on a shattered, rusted stagecoach that had lain forgotten in the deep, rocky ravine behind the livery stable for 7 long years. To the mocking onlookers who watched the blacksmith strike his gavel, it was nothing more than an expensive pile of splintered hickory, rotted leather, and twisted iron carriage bolts, destined to sink further into the mud. Yet, as the north wind began to howl through the pines, they could not have known that sealed deep within the weather-beaten, mouse-chewed remains of that forgotten vessel lay a secret that would not only rewrite the destiny of the entire valley, but also restore a broken community to its rightful hands. Settle in and let us tell you the story of Clara Mercer. If you are listening to this from a quiet room where the world feels large and your own burdens feel heavy, we invite you to share your thoughts in the comments below. Long before the shadow of Thaddeus Vance stretched across the valley, Clara had been a creature of the high timber country, raised by a father whose hands were permanently stained with the sweet, sharp scent of freshly sawn cedar and white pine. Thomas Mercer had been a man of quiet iron and profound gentleness, arriving in the territory when the town of Oakhaven was nothing more than a cluster of canvas tents and a single sputtering pit sore beside the rushing waters of the Blackwood River. He taught his daughter to read the language of the forest, showing her how to discern the structural integrity of a standing oak by the rhythm of an axe handle's vibration against the palm, and how to respect the grain of the wood, ensuring that every board produced by their water-powered mill was straight, true, and built to withstand the fierce mountain winters. Clara spent her youth not in the parlor rooms of the town's emerging high society, but on the grease-slicked timbers of the mill deck, her apron pockets filled with iron nails and small squares of sandpaper, her mind absorbing the meticulous geometry of joinery and the patient art of restoration. She learned that nothing truly valuable was created in a hurry, and that the most resilient structures were those built upon foundations that had been seasoned by time and trial. Her father had possessed a rare philosophy for a frontiersman. He believed that wealth was not measured by the coins hoarded in an iron lockbox, but by the number of roofs his mill had helped to raise over the heads of honest, hard-working homesteaders who arrived in the valley with little more than a trunk of clothes and a dream of survival. When the winter snows isolated the high valleys, it was the Mercer mill that extended credit to the struggling families, providing the timber for barns and hearths without demanding immediate payment, a practice that earned them a deep, unspoken devotion from the local farmers, but drew the quiet, calculating scorn of the town's emerging merchants. Clara watched and mirrored her father's steady grace, developing an eye that could see the hidden strength within a weathered, graying beam that others deemed fit only for the cookstove fire, understanding that under the rough, scarred exterior of the wilderness lay a profound and enduring beauty waiting to be uncovered by patient, reverent hands. The shift in the valley's tide began in the late autumn of 1882, when a prolonged drought withered the high meadows and caused the Blackwood River to drop to a sluggish, muddy trickle that could barely turn the massive overshot wheel of the Mercer mill. It was during this season of vulnerability that Thomas Mercer's health began to fail, his lungs burdened by decades of sawdust and the damp chill of the river canyons, leaving Clara to manage the ledger books and the daily physical toil of the yard alone. Sensing an opportunity to consolidate his control over the region's timber supplies, Thaddeus Vance, a ruthless speculator who had amassed a fortune by charging exorbitant interest rates to desperate homesteaders through his private land office, began to quietly purchase the outstanding debts of the local farmers who owed money to the mill. When the river finally froze completely that winter, halting all production and preventing Clara from fulfilling a major lumber contract for the expanding railway line, Vance struck with the cold precision of a birds of prey, presenting a series of manufactured legal claims and demand notes that her father had signed in good faith during leaner years. Despite Clara's exhaustive efforts to negotiate a payment plan, working until her fingers bled under the dim light of a kerosene lantern as she tried to balance the dwindling accounts, Vance refused every concession, his eyes fixed firmly on the valuable riverfront acreage and the pristine timber stands that the Mercers had protected for a generation. The final blow fell on a bleak Tuesday morning when Thomas Mercer passed away in his sleep, his heart finally yielding to the strain of the encroaching ruin, leaving Clara entirely alone to face the iron-faced sheriff whom Vance had hired to enforce the foreclosure decree. Within 3 days of her father's burial under the frozen earth of the hillside cemetery, Clara was forced to watch as Vance's hired men padlocked the heavy oak doors of the mill, piled her personal belongings into the mud of the roadside, and warned her that any attempt to trespass on the property would result in her immediate imprisonment. With her home confiscated and her livelihood violently stripped away, Clara found temporary shelter in a drafty, abandoned line shack at the edge of the town common, her world reduced to the meager possessions she could carry in a canvas sack and the 3 small coins remaining in her hand after paying for her father's modest pine coffin. The town of Oakhaven, once a place of mutual support, had grown cold and fearful under Vance's expanding monopoly, with many of her old neighbors averting their eyes when she passed down the wooden boardwalks, terrified of drawing the financial ire of the man who now controlled the bank, the general store, and the very land beneath their feet. It was on the second Saturday of November that the town held its monthly salvage and estate auction behind the livery stable, a grim gathering where the discarded remnants of broken dreams and failed enterprises were sold to the highest bidder to satisfy tax liens and unpaid storage fees. Clara attended not out of a desire to buy, but simply to escape the biting wind that howled through the gaps in her shack's walls, standing at the rear of the shivering crowd as the auctioneer moved rapidly through lots of rusted plows, cracked harnesses, and water-damaged furniture. At the very end of the day, when the sky had turned the color of bruised iron, and the crowd began to disperse toward the warmth of the local tavern, the auctioneer pointed his gavel toward the bottom of the steep, rocky ravine that bordered the property, where the skeletal, overturned wreckage of an old Concord stagecoach lay half buried in a drift of dead leaves and frozen mud. This was the infamous Deadwood Ghost, a carriage that had been ambushed by road agents 7 years prior, its driver killed, its horses stolen, and its main body shattered against the boulders before being abandoned by the transport company as a total loss, deemed completely unrecoverable and worthless by every teamster and blacksmith in the territory. When the auctioneer jokingly called for an opening bid of $1 on the splintered heap, the crowd laughed, shouting that a person would have to pay someone just to haul the rotted firewood away. But Clara, stepping forward from the shadows with a sudden, unexplainable clarity of purpose, raised her hand and offered her last 2 silver half-dollars, her voice ringing out clear and steady through the frosty air. The auctioneer, eager to conclude the proceedings and retreat indoors, struck his mallet against the wooden rail before anyone could protest, declaring the shattered stagecoach sold to the penniless miller's daughter for the grand sum of $1, a transaction that drew derisive chuckles from the remaining onlookers, who mocked her for exchanging her final bit of currency for a pile of frozen rubbish. Ignoring their jeers, Clara walked down into the steep, slippery incline of the ravine, her boots sinking into the icy slush as she approached her purchase, her practiced eye immediately seeing past the shattered wheels and the missing doors to the underlying bones of the vehicle. The main carriage body, though severely weathered and scarred by bullet holes from the long-ago raid, had been constructed from premium, seasoned white ash and reinforced with heavy iron bands that had resisted the worst of the rust, a testament to the master craftsman who had built it decades before. Working with a borrowed crowbar and the stubborn resilience that had sustained her through the loss of her family, she spent the remaining hours of daylight clearing away the heavy rocks and rotting timber that pinned the coach to the ravine floor, her hands freezing through her thin mittens as she painstakingly inspected every inch of the structure. It was during her examination of the interior, as she cleared away a thick nest of dried grass and rodent debris from beneath the collapsed driver's bench, that her fingers brushed against an unusual resistance within the framework of the lower seat support. The main leather cushions had long since rotted away into black mold, but beneath the splintered pine floorboards of the seating box, hidden within a double-walled cavity that had been cleverly integrated into the iron frame to protect valuables from road dust and thieves, she discovered a heavy, oilcloth parcel tightly bound with waxed linen cord. With her heart hammering against her ribs, Clara concealed the heavy bundle beneath her woolen shawl and climbed out of the dark ravine, returning to the freezing privacy of her line shack, where she lit a single, precious tallow candle to illuminate the mystery she had uncovered. As she carefully cut the cracked, frozen wax cords and unfolded the layers of heavy, grease-treated cloth, the scent of old tallow and preserved paper filled the small room, revealing not gold coins or jewelry, but a meticulously drafted surveyor's journal and a series of hand-drawn topographical maps dating back to the earliest exploration of the territory. The documents had belonged to Arthur Pendleton, the legendary government surveyor who had perished in the very Stagecoach ambush 7 years prior, a man whose official records regarding the valley's true boundaries and mineral rights had supposedly been destroyed in the attack, allowing Thaddeus Vance to subsequently claim vast tracts of land under the guise of unclaimed public domain. As Clara turned the yellowed, fragile pages with trembling fingers, her eyes locked onto a detailed chart of the Oakhaven Valley that featured a red-inked boundary line, significantly different from the official plats currently registered at the county courthouse. Pendleton's journal contained precise, daily geometric calculations and astronomical placements, proving that the original land grants for the entire Western Ridge, including the Mercer Mill, the town common, and 30 established homesteads, had been deliberately mismeasured and falsified by Vance during the town's initial incorporation. More shocking still was a sealed letter addressed to the territorial governor, tucked into the back cover of the ledger, detailing absolute proof that Vance had bribed the original district land agent to alter the public records, effectively stealing thousands of acres of fertile soil and timberland from the government and the settlers, while rendering every single foreclosure he had executed over the past decade completely illegal. The true significance of the discovery deepened as Clara studied the final map in the collection, which detailed a massive, hitherto unknown subterranean aquifer and a rich vein of high-grade copper ore running directly beneath the mountain ridge that Vance had recently seized from her father. The shattered stagecoach had not merely been a vehicle of transportation. It had been a rolling vault containing the legal truth of the entire valley's geography, preserved by the genius of its double-walled construction from both the elements and the desperate greed of the outlaws who had attacked it. Outlaws whom Pendleton's journal strongly implied had been hired by Vance himself to eliminate the surveyor before he could deliver his report to the capital. Clara realized with profound clarity that she held the absolute power to dismantle Vance's empire, but she also understood the immense danger of her situation. If the land baron discovered that the proof of his decades of fraud and violence was in the hands of the woman he had just ruined, he would not hesitate to use any means necessary to silence her and destroy the evidence forever. Instead of rushing to the local sheriff, who was well known to be under Vance's financial influence, Clara spent the next 3 days methodically transcribing every map and journal entry onto small scraps of wrapping paper, concealing the original documents inside the hollow lining of her father's old wooden spirit level, a tool she knew Vance's men would never think to examine. She then began to quietly visit the oldest homesteaders in the valley under the cover of night, showing them the transcriptions and comparing the original boundary markers described by Pendleton with the altered fences that Vance's surveyors had erected over the years, slowly awakening a spark of hope and righteous fury in the hearts of a populace that had long lived in silent submission. The expected conflict erupted on the following Thursday, when Thaddeus Vance, having learned from the auctioneer that Clara had been spending her days clearing the wreckage from the ravine, arrived at the line shack accompanied by 2 heavily armed guards and the town marshal, demanding that she immediately vacate the property and surrender the stagecoach wreckage, claiming it was an eyesore that violated town ordinances. Standing in the doorway with her father's old iron square in her hand, Clara stood her ground, her voice projecting across the muddy street where a crowd of curious townsfolk had begun to gather, attracted by the confrontation between the destitute miller's daughter and the valley's undisputed master. Vance sneered at her resistance, offering her a single silver dollar to buy back the wreckage, his tone laced with a thin, menacing venom, as he warned her that pride was an expensive luxury for a woman who had nowhere left to sleep and no food to fill her belly. It was at this moment that Clara stepped out onto the boardwalk, refusing the coin and looking Vance directly in the eye as she declared that the Stagecoach was not for sale at any price because it had already delivered its final and most valuable cargo to the people of Oakhaven. Before Vance could order his men to move her aside, 3 of the valley's oldest and most respected farmers stepped forward from the crowd, followed closely by the local blacksmith and dozens of other homesteaders, creating a solid, silent wall of determined citizens that forced the marshal to hesitantly lower his hand from his pistol holster. Clara openly challenged Vance's authority, quoting the exact boundary coordinates from Pendleton's journal and revealing to the gathered crowd that the very land Vance stood upon did not belong to him, but was public domain that had been stolen through systemic forgery and political corruption. The confrontation reached its climax 2 weeks later when the territorial circuit judge arrived in Oakhaven for the biannual court session, an event that Vance had traditionally dominated through his influence over the grand jury and his control of the local legal infrastructure. In a packed, sweltering courtroom filled to the doors with anxious settlers, Clara presented the original oilcloth packet, the surveyor's maps, and the sealed letter to the governor, the pristine authenticity of Pendleton's handwriting and official seal, completely dismantling the falsified deeds that Vance's attorneys desperately tried to present in defense. The evidence was so absolute and the fury of the gathered community so palpable that the judge immediately stripped Vance of his fraudulent land titles, voided every foreclosure he had executed over the past 7 years, and issued an immediate warrant for his arrest on charges of grand larceny and conspiracy to defraud the United States government. The restoration of the valley was swift and total. The Mercer Mill was returned to Clara's rightful ownership, and every family that had been driven from their homesteads by Vance's illegal tactics was granted full legal title to their land, alongside a substantial restitution fund carved directly from the liquidation of Vance's remaining assets. Rather than claiming the vast copper deposits on the ridge for her personal enrichment, Clara deeded the mineral rights to a collective town trust, ensuring that the wealth generated by the mountain would forever fund the local school, the maintenance of the roads, and a permanent relief fund for any family facing hardship during the bitter winter months. As the following spring brought the first green shoots of clover to the high meadows, the Blackwood River swelled with the melting mountain snows, its powerful, roaring current once again turning the massive oak wheel of the Mercer Mill with a steady, rhythmic thumping that sounded to the valley like the very heartbeat of justice restored. Clara stood on the newly rebuilt timber deck, her hands resting comfortably on the smooth, planed surface of a fresh cedar beam, looking out over a bustling yard where neighbors worked side by side to load lumber wagons destined for new barns and secure homes across the territory. The shattered stagecoach was eventually hauled up from the dark depths of the ravine by a team of 16 oxen, its broken frame carefully stabilized and placed in the center of the town square, not as a monument to tragedy or lawlessness, but as an enduring symbol of the hidden truth that waits patiently in the darkness for those who possess the eyes to see it. We remember how she stood on that frozen mud with nothing but 42 years of sorrow, 2 silver half-dollars, and a town that had written her off, proving that the most broken, discarded remnants of our world can become the very cornerstones of our salvation when guided by a spirit that refuses to bend to tyranny. Settle in your hearts the memory of Clara Mercer, who found the wealth of an entire valley hidden within the cushions of a shattered dream. We are so grateful you chose to spend your time with us today, listening to this story of resilience and quiet justice beneath the western skies. If this tale brought a sense of warmth to your day, please consider sharing it with someone who might need to remember that value is often found in the most unexpected places. Before you leave, tell us in the comments, what is a time you found great value or hope in something that others had completely written off? Until next time, stay close,